So let's start with L. Ron Hubbard, shall we? He was born in 1911 to a teacher and a Navy officer, so one would imagine that's quite comfortable, especially for 1911. Those are pretty good professions. So you'd imagine he had a reasonable, stable upbringing, but he did move around a lot because of his father's role in the Navy, so it seemed like I think that does shape how people perceive the world and how they carry themselves. You can kind of tell when someone's moved around a lot because they tend to be a bit more introverted, maybe. They're not nearly as personable as someone who stayed in the same place. And that's not really their fault, obviously.
I think kids, especially little kids, do need stability, some sort of stability. So if you are moving around constantly in your sort of younger formative years, it's probably not ideal. It's not necessarily a problem, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have psychological issues in adulthood, but yeah, it's probably not ideal. Wasn't he born in Nebraska? Is that right?
Something like that, yeah.
All right, okay. It's not a classic naval place for naval officers to be, is it? Nebraska. But all right. Anyway.
But supposedly, when he was in school, in the sophomore year of high school, he gets bad grades, and then in the junior year, he gets held back and then drops out of his second attempt. And then he attempts to join the Navy Academy and fails. And then he attends a course at a YMCA, which was called Woodward High, if you're interested. He gets reasonable passing grades, so he can finally finish high school. And this doesn't come across as some sort of religious messiah so far, does it? So he somehow manages to get to George Washington University. He was there for 2 years, but gets bad grades and drops out. And whilst he was there, he joined the Marine Reserves, and he served for 5 weeks before being discharged. And the military records, which people have since been able to view, show that he was coded as not for re-enlistment. Basically, yeah, this guy is incapable of doing the job.
Bad at taking orders, I guess.
I wouldn't say necessarily the taking orders part, more so he was a bit stupid.
Okay.
I think is fair to say. So he did stay in DC after he dropped out of university and befriend.
Sorry, just to put this into context, this is before World War II. Are we talking?
Yes. Yeah, long before.
Okay.
I think it's between World War I and World War II. So he stayed in DC and befriended a bunch of psychiatrists, which gave him lots of insights into the profession. He managed to see some like mental health wards, I suppose you can call them. That's what they'd be called in the modern day. They probably had a different name back then. But he kind of got embedded in that world for a little while, although he was somewhat encouraged because one of the psychologists he befriended had a belief that you didn't need a piece of paper to qualify you to be a psychiatrist. Anyone can really do it as long as they've got the ability to do it, which I'm somewhat sympathetic towards, but also I think the whole notion of psychiatry is nonsense as well. So, of course, I'm not going to think it's very hard to qualify because it's a load of pseudoscience and it's, we're going to hypnotise you and you're going to get, these suppressed memories bubble up to the surface. Never mind the fact that when you hypnotise someone, you make them suggestible, so you can implant false memories in them quite easily of, oh, I've got this very vague recollection of this thing happening to me, and it's provably false. These sorts of methods are nonsense in my view, and more harm than good. Just worth saying. So, fast forwarding to 1933, he married and would go on to father some children. It's not really too pertinent. I've tried to keep it very bare bones because the details of his life aren't as interesting as how his life has shaped how he formed Scientology. So, he and his family were very poor, and Hubbard started writing fiction stories, which he seemed to be relatively good at. So by 1940, he'd written hundreds of short stories that he'd basically been writing for pulp fiction magazines, which, of course, now is sort of synonymous with Quentin Tarantino's film, but it is, of course, borrowed from the sort of magazines with cheap, pulpy paper rather than anything else, rather than the glossy ones, which were seen as more expensive. So he'd also written a few full-length novels, the first of which was published in 1937. I think it was about a blonde-haired person who'd been accepted by the Blackfoot tribe or something like that. So it's sort of Native American themed story, but it was well received by the New York Times, which I think certainly helped his career, because by this point they were sort of tastemakers in literature, which they still are to some extent today. So on New Year's Day 1938, he had a reaction to dental anesthetic gas in what was a routine procedure, and he claims that this triggered a revelatory near-death experience, which, as far as religious experiences go, the dental chair, I'm not so sure, because having been put under anaesthetic at the dentist, it didn't feel like a religious experience. It just felt weird. I didn't feel transcendent at all. I suppose it was the near-death part. I think he had a bad reaction to it, and so that might be why he came close to death, and it kind of revealed to him some aspect of life. But it's not entirely clear what actually happened here. I wasn't able to dig up any more details about it.
This is new to me. I didn't know that part of his life, actually. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. But it seems like the first sort of inclination of some sort of religious experience, I suppose you could say.
I don't know if it is religious or not, but I think that very frequently people talk about experiences they had, and there are two ways to think of it. There are more, but I think one way is to take that experience at face value, and the other is to have a more third-person approach to it and try and find out, what happened. Were there something in the brain that could trigger such an experience or alter it? There's always the element of interpretation of it. So I really don't know what to say on this, but I think that this is where there will be divergence in ways that people proceed to understand such experiences. Because I've heard a lot about people who talk about near-death experiences, and I really don't know what to make of them, because it seems to me that, for instance, when people talk about being in a coma for years, and then they have zero brain activity, but then the brain starts functioning a bit. Well, I mean, probably it's the brain, but there's a propensity to people to want to claim that somehow they are special, and I think that a lot of people who have been associated with cults, that don't go out telling them that I'm basically nobody. They try and create an elevate image for themselves.
Hubbard certainly did that, and lots of accounts of people who knew him personally said that he was rather full of himself despite having absolutely no reason to be.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've had a few near-death experiences just because I'm stupid sometimes, and yeah, they're just horrible. I don't know why anyone says, it was like a religious experience. I'm not sure that's what he was claiming necessarily, but it changed his perspective in some way. But no, like, it's just thoroughly unpleasant. It reminds you of your mortality. It's not nice. It doesn't feel like a religious experience. It feels like something that's quite sort of dehumanizing in a sense. It's just like, oh right, so death can find you at any moment. Like, there was a time where I nearly choked on some steak. So I had like steak fat, and it was quite long. I tried to chew it, but I couldn't chew it down, and so I tried to swallow it, and it got a bit stuck.
Yeah.
I shouldn't laugh.
It is funny.
Sorry, I've had the same thing with some bacon. Nearly suffocated to death on some bacon. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Carry on.
Things we love can turn out to kill us. It's terrible. But no, I just thought, my final moment's going to be in a Toby Carvery, which if you're in Britain, it doesn't have, it's seen as a little bit proletarian, I think is a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, I've heard many people say who didn't buy into L. Ron Hubbard's persona that he was just extraordinarily arrogant. But I think that near-death experiences, any sort of general anaesthetic, or even sometimes just dreams, any sort of psychedelic experience, everyone experiences it a bit different. You know how sometimes people can witness the same event and they walk away and their eyewitness testimony is completely different, pretty much completely different. Or we get it in comments on things that people pretty much hear different things almost to what you're saying. they disagree on what you've just said, and it's like, it's right there, the evidence right there of what was said and what wasn't said, and people are arguing about what was said. So when it comes to something like a psychedelic experience or a near-death experience or anything like that, even dreams, sometimes some people are going to take away from it what seems like sort of a wildly extrapolated conclusions about what they experienced. I just think that is sort of that happens all the time.
And to be somewhat charitable to him, he was probably feeling a bit funky from the anaesthetic, and he did nearly die because he had a reaction to it. So if you've had a reaction when you're not necessarily yourself as well, that's going to kind of elevate that. So, I was poking fun, but I can kind of understand.
It even includes, I would say, even any sort of traumatic experience. It doesn't need to be near death. It doesn't need to be as extreme as that. It doesn't need to be an actual, strong psychedelic experience or anything. It could just be something triggers in your mind that suddenly, for whatever reason, you become sort of painfully aware of your own mortality or something. Someone close to you dies, or whatever it is. Or you nearly die, or you weren't actually injured in any way. Just like, a car nearly hit you, and suddenly something flips in your mind, and you're psychologically different from that moment onwards. That sort of happens to us all to various extents.
Very true.
So obviously, I didn't know this event in L. Ron Hubbard's life, but it seems like it was. You could argue it's a fairly pivotal one. Is that what he said?
No, it's just kind of implied that it happened, and perhaps this is like the sort of snowball that started an avalanche. That's kind of the impression that I get might have happened, that it kind of put this seed in his mind that went on to grow, maybe. But it's just something to throw in there to kind of get a measure of the man, really. So did you have something to say?
No, I was saying that it's like with people who say that they see light. I mean, in some dreams also you see them in color. And they say that, I see light, therefore it's like heaven, the doors of heaven opening wide for me to cross. And then they come back to life, and they can't make sense of it. It's one way of interpreting things. I think, as you said, it involves wild extrapolations, and it seems to be the least plausible way to think of things.
Right. I'm going to quickly fire through some of his naval career.
Can I add something about the beginning?
Sure.
Yeah, because I think that it's really important to say that he was traveling a lot with his family. Because I think that this, as you said, Beau, it is important for stability, because many children who travel around, they feel that they lose their friends and they become scared of attachment. So I'm willing to bet that somehow there is such an issue, or without knowing the case, that there is such an issue of being scared of attachment on the one hand, but also wanting to have an audience to combat loneliness or feelings of loneliness on the other. Because if you want people to be somehow like followers of this kind, it seems to me that you hate being alone. Basically, you want people to love you and adore you.
Well, when you find out his marital history, you will soon find out that you're pretty much spot on the money there. Okay. So, in 1941, he joined the US Navy as a lieutenant junior grade in the United States Naval Reserve. He didn't get through perhaps meritocratic means, because, of course, his father was in the Navy. I think he used his father's connections to get in, and at a rank that he clearly wasn't fit to do. So he was sent to the Philippines via Australia the day after Pearl Harbor, and he was assigned to an intel billet when he arrived. And this is a quote from the US Naval Attaché to Australia, and this is from February the 14th, 1942, so about a year afterwards or so. This officer is not satisfactory for independent duty assignment. He is garrulous and tries to give impressions of his importance. He also seems to think that he has unusual ability in most lines. These characteristics indicate that he will require close supervision for satisfactory performance of any intelligence duty.
So argumentative and arrogant.
Mm-hmm.
Garrulous, sort of argumentative. One thing I would say is that it seems to be, well, it not seems to be, it is the case that lots of the details of his life, I think deliberately, are sort of up for debate. So one thing I read or saw was that the naval record said that during wartime he never left the continental United States.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But it's also, I know, a big part of his legend that he fought in the Pacific.
He definitely didn't fight in the Pacific.
Well, not fight, sorry, didn't see combat, but was just, well, in Australia. So 1942, it's the war in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor's December 7th, 1941, right? So it's 1940. So there's full-blown naval combat with the Japanese in the Pacific.
But,
yeah, I don't think even he claims he saw action or anything in naval
I'm not even
engagements,
entirely sure he got to Australia. I think he got turned back because he sent an intelligence boat basically 3,000 miles out of the way to nowhere, and they're just like, this is an unacceptable waste of resources, go back.
So he was an
to
officer.
America.
Right.
He was in charge of stuff.
Right.
Yeah. This officer, and it says at the start of the quote.
Sorry.
So he was sent back to the United States because of clearly being incompetent, and was assigned to the command of a naval yard patrol vessel in Massachusetts.
So that's on the East Coast.
Yeah, the other
so
coast.
Get him as far away from action as possible.
So the shipyard's commander stated that Hubbard was not temperamentally fitted for independent command and requested he be immediately relieved of duty. He was, in 1943, he was then put on a sub-chasing vessel, and within 5 hours of being on the vessel and being in command of it, he thought they had encountered an enemy submarine, and then this followed a 68-hour combat ordeal in which it seems like they were chasing ghosts, in a sense. They spent 68 hours in combat, and apparently an investigation found that there was no sub, and that Hubbard had mistaken a known iron deposit for a sub, which you would think is kind of 101 if you're looking for a large metal object. You should probably know where the iron deposits are, because those are going to ping up. I mean, I've never chased a submarine before, but one would presume that, you want to discount the false positives and that it's a possibility. But no, L. Ron Hubbard, he was certain. He knew that there was an enemy submarine because he's L. Ron Hubbard and he's going to get all the action. But it's just ridiculous that they spent 68 hours fighting an imaginary iron deposit. Well, a real iron deposit, but an imaginary submarine, sorry.
See, I've heard a variant on that it was in Oregon, which is on the west coast still, and it was some sort of floating tree trunk or floating log or something that he thought was a submarine. And again, sort of fired on it. And, well, it's just completely embarrassing, isn't it? It sort of reveals the fact that you don't know what you're doing at all.
Thank you for watching that clip from my series Contemplations. If you want to sign up to the website for £5 a month, you can access that series, which comes out 1 p.m. every Saturday. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.